Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the memorial for Charlie Kirk, California's mask ban for ICE agents, and the Trump administration moving against Tylenol. I'm joined by Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So we saw comments from a couple of people. One, the writer Thomas Chatterton Williams, saying that the images and videos from the Charlie Kirk Memorial in the Arizona Cardinals Stadium seemed utterly foreign, like an alien culture. And I think a lot of Americans were very struck, and I think in the cases of a lot of people in media and academia, struck kind of strangely by the images from that mass gathering. Ashley, Geoff, what did you make of it?
So in some ways, it seemed like harking back to aspects of the 2000s era Republican Party, when you had a strong identification between George W. Bush, at the time figurehead of the party, and sort of Protestant evangelical megachurch culture. And so obviously, Kirk had a kind of strong affiliation with that culture, and that culture never went away or ceased to be a significant part of the Republican coalition. But in some ways, you could argue its issues have been sidelined. We saw last year Trump working assiduously to marginalize the pro-life, lobby or sort of activist faction within the Republican political class, and kind of squeeze their concerns out of the party platform to the greatest extent possible. Trump himself, often thought of as a kind of pagan figure, a figure of kind of pagan sensibilities, representing a kind of post-Christian GOP. Interestingly, I'll say one more thing about culture, and then I'll go back to Trump's paganism. But, so the thing that was striking was just I don't think people should be surprised. I think Thomas was a bit, I was surprised by his alienation. I mean, I understand in the sense that that's not the culture I grew up in or grew up around. He and I probably have somewhat similar backgrounds in terms of being from suburban New York and from sort of pointy-headed intellectual families. But nonetheless, it was clearly a sort of very significant presence in American public culture. And the example I pointed to was that the fact that Barack Obama in 2008 invited Rick Warren, the megachurch pastor of Saddleback Church in Southern California, to deliver the invocation at his first inauguration. And so this was really, Obama, in terms of, when he came into power, really trying to recognize the significance of this demographic and this presence in the culture of sort of, megachurch evangelicals, and to at least kind of extend an olive branch to them, even though really getting many of them into his coalition was probably unrealistic. There were, a handful of sort of liberal evangelicals in that period who at least were making this argument. So the point is, back then it was clearly recognized that was a very, very significant part of American culture, American public culture, American life. And so Obama himself recognized that by inviting Warren. So the thing that strikes me about the Kirk event was the most dramatic contrast was between the widow, Erica Kirk, stating that Charlie, I think this was the most noteworthy and really striking moment in the event, stating that, Charlie had attempted to help and reach out to young men like the man who ended up assassinating him. And I think there's a basic truth to that. You can argue, okay, well, he wasn't really, he was trying to convert them into members of his political faction. He wasn't just trying to kind of help them out of the goodness of his heart. You could make those quibbles, but the point nevertheless remains that he was somebody who really specialized in outreach to young people and young men in particular, and probably has some responsibility for having brought younger men towards the right. And it's interesting. I listened to an episode of the Know Your Enemy podcast where they talked to a couple of academics who are researching minorities moving to the right, Black, Latino, and Asian voters moving to the right in recent years. And they talked in this interview about the fact that Turning Point, Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Points, was hugely significant in outreach to young, not just young men, but young men of diverse, backgrounds, races, ethnicities, et cetera. And that they had attended some of those events and they were very diverse. So point being, he was significant in this regard. RFK Kirk pointed this out, and then, strikingly said she forgave the young man in this, quintessential kind of Christian, statement of Christian faith. And so that was very striking. And then equally striking was the fact that Trump said he disagreed with this and with Kirk himself. That Kirk wanted to do outreach, wanted to befriend his enemies. Trump hates his enemy, and Trump said he hates his enemies and just wants to, punish and destroy them. I can't remember exactly what he said. So really, we did have the stark comparison of the Christian GOP and the post-Christian GOP, calling us back to this, at this point, sort of classic Rust Outfit tweet about, if you hate, I can't remember exactly what it was, but if you hate and fear sort of Christian conservatives, just wait till you see post-Christian conservatives. So, this is about as clear a kind of showcasing of that as you could find. And so, I think it was interesting to see that. And then it was interesting to see the various attempts to, and obviously you could argue there's, people were saying, well, this just shows there's a fundamental contradiction. There's something, deeply, that there's an unresolvable tension in this coalition. They have to choose one or the other. I don't think that's really true because, in American Protestant tradition, obviously you've had these fundamental Christian ideas about forgiveness and grace always being present, but you have also always had a strong kind of punitive strain, a strong strain of a kind of harshness and of a support for a judicial system, at least that is that is not informed by some kind of soft, Christian, soft version of Christian sensibilities. So I'm not sure this is as much, I think you can argue there's a kind of spiritual tension there, but to the extent that's true, that has a much longer history and is a much more deeply embedded aspect of conservatism and its relation to Christianity. And I don't, I think it's not some kind of, as some observers said, it's not some kind of fundamental choice. Probably there's going to be some, that there's always going to be some presence of both of these dispositions in any conservative coalition.
Yeah, I mean, the point that you made a moment ago about Trump kind of, obviously this was one of the most jarring things about that, about the funeral that was sort of played over and over and over again was Erica Kirk forgiving her husband's killer. And in spite of the fact that, this is something that's been observed a few times, in spite of the fact that they're seeking the death penalty, a lot of people have asked, what does it mean to forgive somebody if you seek the death penalty, if you seek that kind of retribution? But again, Trump coming out and saying, no, I hate my enemies, because it was funny because while she was speaking, I was thinking to myself, this reminds me a little bit of the left, like the left being like, I care so much about, I just feel so terrible about these people who are low information rats, this sort of like faux care for the downtrodden that just was like this thin veil for hatred and of these people who just don't know any better, and this desire to kind of take them under your wing and take care of them. That was that faux love sneering that dominated politics for such a long time, where all of these sort of like problematic people were seen as ideally victims. And if you couldn't slot people into that victim, that nice little victim of poverty or whatever, place, then you didn't really know what to do with them. And then the spite came out. And it was just sort of, I found that kind of interesting that you had this kind of, this is a horrible thing to say, but a forgiveness that was really a statement of I'm holier than thou because I'm able to forgive. I know that's a horrible thing to say. But the interesting thing was that Trump reveals what makes him such a powerful political figure, which is what I'm often saying is I'm amazed at how good he is at this, is that he doesn't give any of that faux, doesn't pretend to be on a high horse. He just literally says, no, I hate you. No, it's true. I absolutely hate you. And that is endearing in a weird way after so many years of the pretense of everything that I do is for your own good and for the benefit of the nation. When we all knew it wasn't true, Trump just says, no, I'm out here to spite my enemies. And I'm like, okay, well, spite, I don't know. And it's sort of like, well, okay, at least you know what we're dealing with here. And I found that to be actually weirdly refreshing. But the other thing about the funeral, of course, was that it was so, it was like a campaign, it was like a rally, more than a funeral. But the other thing was how much Christianity obviously was at the center of it. And I just thought, oh, this is going to empower that contingent of, not empower, but embolden or make people make this contingent feel very self-righteous about who is absolutely sure that there's this huge hegemon in American culture, and that is Christianity. As though the church is just as powerful as it was in 1950, that we just have to continually, like I've said this for years, like the left just loves to rail against the ghosts of things that have been dead for decades, because that's their comfort zone, where they pretend that everybody's uptight sexually, pretend that everybody's Christian, pretend that everybody is like adhering to rigid gender norms and they're doing something really great and crazy by swapping. And so this big display there will make people say, oh, look, see, Christianity is the great hegemon. This is something that we need to really fight against. When I feel like it's very performative, the use of Christianity, the looseness with which doctrine is approached. It's not something you would really go into battle with seriously because they wouldn't care. It's not a serious Christianity. It's more a reaction. It's more it's a rise of Christianity that speaks to an exhaustion with the demonization of Christians for such a long time. And of course, maybe it's pointless to point this out because it's so obvious, but that contingency that sees the church as this all-powerful decider of American politics and that provides a morality that must be fought against at all costs is so incredibly hypocritical, because Muslims are never made to account for themselves. They're never seen as like the fundamentalist religious people. It's somehow this is all fine. That's fine. And this is less obvious in the US, but I think in the UK, if you have somebody, it's more obvious. It comes out more because it's much more of a obviously secular society where you don't even have the performance of religion. Where if you have a would-be MP who has a religious background, it's like, oh, are you just saying this because it's Christian? And if anybody succeeds in framing an issue or opposition to a policy as Christian, then that opposition is done. That policy is definitely going to pass. So this is what's happening with assisted dying, for instance. The people who are in favor of it are trying very hard to frame assisted dying as just like a weird Christian thing. But at the same time, they will hold up like there's no questioning of people who are quite religious, but who are adherents of Islam. This is not seen as a problem. Nobody, well, are you pursuing that policy because of your Muslim background, that means nothing. It's just weird, because then people will have, if they kind of were consistent, then they would have to confront a contradiction in their politics where they're terrified of fundamentalist Christianity, but because they see fundamentalist Islam as a partner in arms against Western culture and Western civilization, they never have to apply that same criteria to them. So I would just say, if that whole spectacle made you think that Christianity, yes, see, we were too easy on those Christians, we need to come down hard, point out that this is not Christianity, or ensure that we destroy religion or whatever. Well, one, be consistent, and two, recognize that Christianity is really not the hegemon it once was, 75 years ago.
I think I'll disagree with that a bit, because I think the UK is very different from the US. Like I think
I know,
especially when it comes to
this is what I'm saying.
the public role of Christianity. But it's very clear to me that throughout my lifetime there have, that's explicitly religious, Christian politicians and, political causes have been hugely effective and influential. And so I don't think that's really true in the UK. And so it seems to me that's a fundamental difference. So I'm not sure the comparison quite holds in my view.
I often wonder how the trans thing took off, because for such a long time, like, who gave a crap about gender roles? What did that have to do with anything? And everyone talking about like the rigidity of gender roles. It's like, what's it like over there? And it's like, so it's quite possible that my experience is completely different, that maybe you do live in a religious straitjacket, but I think that you're much more similar to the secularized world than you like to believe, and that a lot of religiosity is a thin veneer for political causes, for much deeper kind of shifts and so on, that are made sense of through a religious lens. I don't think it's a sincere kind of Christianity. That's my take from the outside. I don't think anybody's like taking their political doctrine straight from whatever their religious leader is, the Vatican or whatever. So Protestants from, I don't know what the head of the Protestant church is. I'm now in territory where I don't know.
There is none.
Exactly.
We've got,
yeah.
we've just got mega entrepreneurial mega churches. That's
right. That was the point, wasn't it?
This culture, but yeah.
Yep. Last year, I did an interview with J.D. Vance a few months before he was selected as Donald Trump's vice presidential candidate, and in it, in the article that resulted from the interview, I presented Vance as the face of a new, but by no means entirely novel, religious populism. And I think that term is probably more useful today than religious conservatism, because there is less of a conservative let me put it this way. There's less of a religious culture to preserve, less of a square, staid, observant America to preserve today. But religion, I think, remains, especially kind of revivalist, inflected Christianity. And there's a long history of Catholic revivalism as well. So this isn't specifically about ecclesial divides. But revivalist Christianity, that's a potent force for resisting what might be perceived as a corrupt or failing elite. So that's how I understood the event, as really an expression of this religious populism, which remains religious, remains political, remains potent, but is distinct in some important ways from yesterday's religious conservatism. I was very impressed by Erica Kirk's act of forgiveness. That seemed like a remarkable moment in our public life to me. It's by no means unprecedented. I was also very struck by the forgiveness that the worshipers at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, extended to Dylan Roof, the man who attacked them. That was during the Obama presidency, of course. So I think those moments of forgiveness are very good ones for Christianity in public life. I think a significantly less admirable moment came when Tucker Carlson took to the dais and delivered his remarks. And he said that Kirk was killed, I'm paraphrasing, Kirk was killed for the same reason that Jesus was killed, because he spoke the truth. And he talked about how Jesus speaking the truth upset the hummus eaters gathered in a lamplit room. And obviously, the hummus eaters aren't the Romans; those are the Jews. That's who Carlson is talking about. And uh, a lot of people objected to this comment. A lot of Jewish observers and a lot of committed anti-Semites. I think of E. Michael Jones, the kind of eccentric Catholic writer, celebrated it as a moment in which Carlson was plainly naming the enemy, the Jew. Um, People who want to admire Carlson said, well, too much is being read into this. That's not necessarily what he was saying. But if you look at the way Carlson has talked, certainly since Kirk's shooting, repeatedly trying to draw Jews into it, trying to make it somehow about disagreements Kirk may or may not have had with Jewish donors to his causes. Kirk, Carlson is really trying to suggest that Jews in some way can be blamed for Kirk's shooting. And this may seem illogical to you, but it makes perfect sense from Carlson's perspective. If you believe that Jews secretly control the world, such a momentous event somehow has to occur with their approval or connivance. And this kind of conspiratorial view, this idea that Jews are in charge of everything, fits with another thing Carlson said. He said that Kirk was doing the thing that the people in charge hate most. As the writer Michael Tracy pointed out, though, this is a strange comment given that the room was full of several of the most powerful people in the world. Possibly the people assembled in the room wield more formal power than almost every other leader in the world combined. I mean, China's awfully formidable, but when you're talking about the president of the United States, of his chief officers, it's a very powerful assemblage of people. And so how do you maintain a self-image as a dissident, a self-image as someone who's persecuted, a self-image as an outsider and a rebel, when you actually hold the reins of power, when people who you text with are actually the president, the vice president, and all this? Well, an anti-Semitic theory is really useful then, or any other kind of conspiratorial theory could work. If some shadowy cabal is in control of the world, then it's not really you. It's not really your friends. And that's very handy because it allows you to maintain this outsider image while absolving yourself of responsibility and failing to kind of confront the way in which your own plans are being frustrated by genuine kind of democratic limits or just practical realities. So if kind of Jews are secretly controlling U.S. foreign policy, the fact that Trump attacked the Iranian nuclear reactor, somehow that is the fault of a shadowy cabal, and not just a decision that was made by the duly elected Democratic leader of the country who you happen to have supported. So, Carlson with this kind of framing can kind of absolve himself. But, Carlson has a long history of making insinuations on these lines. He always does it in a way that's deniable. And he says, I love Jews. Ha ha ha. Some of my best friends are Jews. And he gives this manic laugh. And, it's just cowardly. He's a coward. He's unwilling to come out and admit how much he hates and resents this one group of people. So, I would just say that to kind of Christians and conservatives who are listening to this and thinking, look, I'm really tired of the way the left is always accusing everyone of being racist, always accusing everyone of being anti-Semitic. Some cards have been overplayed. but there are other games being played, and Carlson is exploiting the goodwill of a lot of people. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has decided that ICE agents will not be able to mask as they're carrying out their raids. California is bringing this law into effect. Uh, this is an effort to push back against the Trump administration, which has been kind of preempting of local sovereignty on these questions of enforcement and is working around rather than with the local authorities. Is this a healthy pushback against something kind of sinister that's been occurring, or is this just more leftist obstructionism? What's going on here, Geoff? You're kind of the mask expert. I know you've written on it before.
Yes. So I generally think people not showing their faces in public is to be avoided wherever possible. So I take a relatively consistent line on this. I do think there's sort of an interesting series of precedents. I wrote about this topic last year, although in a completely politically reversed situation and having to do with protesters rather than employees of the state, like ICE agents. And it had to do with a ban imposed in Nassau County, New York on on being masked in public. And this was a response to the mostly pro-Palestine protests, which if you saw footage of them were often heavily featured, often majorities of people whose faces were fully covered, sometimes with keffiyehs, sometimes with N95, sometimes with some combination. There's been an interesting kind of merger of like this black bloc culture of Antifa activism, which has kind of merged with COVID safetyism, which remains prevalent in left activist world. And so, these kind of progressive protests do tend to be heavily masked. And so this ban was clearly an attempt to push back against those or to prevent that. And the argument was that it, was enabling people to harass others without facing any consequences for that. And obviously, like a part of the reason why this became such a flashpoint, or why masking in public protests became so significant, was that the protesters themselves believed that they were at risk of harassment. In other words, they were afraid that people would come hostile to them, would come and film them, and then put their identities online, and thus cost them job opportunities and things like that. And so basically, and of course, in the early phase of the post-October 7th protest movement, you had these vans going around like naming and identifying people who had participated in these protests. And so, in other words, the fear of sort of harassment is present on both sides, that that there are people who fear being harassed, and there has been footage showing this kind of thing happening by mass protesters. And then there are people who are, participating in the protests who are afraid that hostile parties will, plaster their faces over the internet and thus, cause them adverse consequences. So, that's the previous flashpoint around masking. Of course, if we went back a few years, we'd have the COVID controversies. And in fact, controversies about public masking go back a very long way in the United States. New York State had a mask ban in place until 2020. So it wasn't necessarily all that heavily enforced, but it actually went back to a protest movement that nobody even remembers, that had to do, it was essentially a kind of populist, small farmer protest against landlords. And it goes back to like the 1850s or so. And so there were these protests, as well as acts of sabotage, vandalism, carried out by these small tenant farmers who had organized into a group. And I can't remember what they called themselves, but they appeared in sort of disguises, costumes. And then, at the behest of the landowners who they were sort of harassing and sabotaging, the New York State legislature banned masks. And that ban stayed in place until 2020, when it was lifted in order to enable the COVID mask mandate. Now, it's interesting to note, though, that so I think you could argue that this original context resembles sort of how the left thinks of these mask bans, which are opposed notably by the ACLU today, the bans on masked public appearance, specifically targeting protesters, opposed by the ACLU on free expression grounds, civil liberties grounds. But so if you go back to the original mask ban, it would seem to be, essentially put in place by powerful interests to hamper the activities of an insurgent sort of populist protest movement. And so it would seem to be targeting the less powerful on behalf of the more powerful. However, it's also noteworthy that some of the most notable enforcements of the New York State mask ban actually involve the KKK. There were various times when the Klan attempted to march in New York City and other parts of New York State, and the mask ban was used to crack down on those marches. So the political valences of it have always been a little ambiguous. If you go back in history, there are numerous conflicts over ordinances banning masks, many of which, unlike the New York one, came somewhat later and were aimed squarely at the Klan specifically, and at the Klans, at being able to have a tool to shut down Klan rallies and to argue that the Klan was intimidating people, much as the opponents or critics of these recent Palestine protests have argued that these masked protesters are being unleashed to intimidate people, specifically Jews, and supporters of Israel. So this basic idea that masking is a form of intimidation often accompanies this debate. And it's interesting that a Georgia Supreme Court decision upholding a ban that was put in place in Georgia to target the Klan specifically. The 1990 Georgia Supreme Court decision said a faceless figure strikes terror into the human heart. So interestingly, in some states like Georgia, these mask bans have been upheld by the state Supreme Court. In other states, I think Indiana struck a similar ban down. So this question of whether public appearance with your face concealed is a matter of free expression is protected by the First Amendment has never actually been resolved, at least at the national level. States have gone different ways with this. And so, what's kind of interesting is that, now we have masking of ICE agents specifically. And, to me, this seems like a slightly separate issue because these are public employees, who are receiving taxpayer funded salaries and are performing public functions in public spaces. And so, my simple view on this would be that I think the First Amendment questions around anonymity and the right to, cover your face are somewhat thorny. I won't voice a clear opinion on this, but I will say that I think if you are a publicly employed, representative of the state, then, except perhaps in a few limited cases, you should be required to show your face, or you should be prohibited from concealing your face and identity. That would be, and so to me, that's just a separate issue from all of these other ones. But it is interesting that the rationale for this is very much the same as why the rationale being provided for why ICE employees have to conceal their identities is very much the same one being argued on the left on behalf of protesters, which is that they, face all kinds of harassment and intimidation. And so if they're forced to reveal their identities, they will put themselves at risk. And so they need to be able to conceal their identities as a protective measure. So, that's essentially the argument that's made on behalf of, and interestingly, also the argument that's made on behalf of online anonymity. I am not sure specifically whether this California ordinance makes sense as a way to address this problem. But I do see it as a problem, and I do think that it should be at least discouraged on a national level for employees of the federal government to, again, conceal their identities while carrying out public functions in public. I think that's, and it just seems very clear to me that when you see the video of the woman who is a student at Tufts being, pulled off the street by masked agents and loaded into a car, this is not this is not the kind of scene that I think is acceptable in a democracy that has rule of law. And so to me, that's just a basic problem that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure whether the California ordinance is the best way to do so, but it seems to me this is a principle, regardless of what we think about people's rights to some degree of protection of identity in public. I don't think those rights apply to you if you are a employee of the state receiving a taxpayer-funded salary carrying out public duties.
Yeah, this is so difficult because I never having written about this, with the exception of obviously masking during COVID, I can see arguments on all sides. And so it makes it really tricky. And I'm tempted to sort of categorize things and say, well, in this case, yes. And then in this case, no. And maybe that's kind of a slimy way of getting out of coming down on one side to cover faces who are not. And avoid making that kind of strong argument. But I also kind of suspect that having a blanket ban on face coverings may be just too convenient for those who would like us to reveal all for sinister purposes. So let me explain what I mean by that. So on the one hand, I can completely understand that why people are afraid to let go of anonymity. On the one hand, you've got increasing use of surveillance technology that is able to, track you and identify you. And I think there's a very big problem with a state that has that kind of technology at its disposal, demanding that everybody show their face. If that is essentially now your fingerprint, your ID, your blueprint for who you are, I don't like that, and I don't like the demand that you should reveal all. I just will always fall down on the side of being suspicious of states who use all kinds of reasons that sound really nice, that want us to do away with any kind of anonymity or any kind of withholding our identification from the state. I find that to be chilling. On the other hand, I have some sympathy for these ICE agents. I know this sounds crazy on the one hand, because, it sounds crazy only if you understand that things go wrong because bad people do bad things. And this is why I have sympathy for these ICE agents, because if you understand immigration and the crackdown on immigration as essentially an individualized issue, if these ICE agents just did the right thing and refused to comply, then we wouldn't have this, kind of harking back maybe a little bit to, the 1930s and the 1940s. If only, good citizens had refused to comply and so on. And this completely disregards any attempt to understand why these things happen from a kind of structural perspective, from a perspective of, economics or the needs of the society, or what game the state is playing at here. Instead, it's sort of like it's this kind of do something politics. I don't know how to deal with those bigger issues, but I can do something now. I can identify that agent, dox him and his family, and then I will feel good. I will be absolved of the guilt of Nazi Germany because I was the good citizen who stood up and did something, which is, powerful. So you have this kind of which is powerful and ironic because it is an individualization of politics. It is a personification of evil in society, and it's ironic because that was what fascism did too. I have a tendency to do that and say that sort of thing. I should probably avoid it, but it's this personification of evil in individuals, and I think that's really corrosive. And I think it's everywhere. It's across the political spectrum, and it underlies this desire to dox people. And so I do understand why people in that situation would want to protect their anonymity, because they know that they'll be targeted and scapegoated for something that is a problem of the capitalist state or whatever. But I do agree with you, Geoff, that if you are getting paid with taxpayer funds and you are carrying out something on behalf of the state, you shouldn't be able to cover your face. On the face of it, that also seems wrong. And so and what about, people who wear full face coverings for religious reasons and so on, which I have a problem with. I think you should show your face. I think it's profoundly antisocial. I think it opens the door for terrorist acts, but I would never ban it. I would argue strongly that that is not a good thing to do, that it's not good for women, that it echoes strongly a misogynistic outlook on the role of women in society, that it lets men off the hook for controlling themselves and so on. But I would never argue for a ban. So I've been, really, really giving this some thought over the past few days. And I wish that I could put forward, a strong argument on either side. And I just have to say, I think in some cases, for instance, if you are an agent of the state and you are carrying out some kind of public function in a public space that is also quite violent and disruptive, I think it just strikes me as horrendously dystopian to be covering your face while you're doing it. The state shouldn't be embarrassed of itself and what it's getting its minions to do. On the other hand, I want us to have a free and open society. I want a society in which we shouldn't have to cover our faces. And I also don't want the state to force us to do so. So I would just fall down on the side of if you're going to do something, you should ask yourself why you feel the need to cover your face when you're doing it. And also, I think that we should try to avoid individualizing politics and going for low-hanging fruit and doxing people and searching for protesters when what we really want is something bigger, maybe beyond our grasp, and that doxing can't solve. So yeah, I am very wishy-washy on this. I don't have a good, I just sort of rehearse arguments on every side, but I don't know. But I feel a little bit vindicated because I've seen you write about this before. And I think you did something similar in that you were sort of saying, I do understand this. And it does have a long history, which is understandable. But on the other hand, I don't want public servants covering their faces.
The Trump administration has warned against Tylenol use during pregnancy, claiming that it increases the risk of autism. The science here seems debatable, to put it mildly, as far as I can see. The attempt to eliminate our autistic brothers and sisters is deplorable. But I think my own interest here is just in the increasing regulation of human reproduction. People ask, why is no one having children anymore? What's going on with our birth rate? Obviously, there are lots of reasons, but I think that there is also this kind of car seat problem. Anyone who has young kids in America knows the agony of getting kids in and out of car seats and buckling them up, these safety regulations. And there's some economic studies that suggest that car seats have measurably decreased the birth rate, just making it too much of a hassle to have kids. You can only fit so many car seats in a car. So if you want to have another kid, you have to buy a new car. And I just think it's in keeping with this broader regulation of human reproduction. A pregnant woman is not supposed to drink alcohol, is not supposed to drink caffeine, is not supposed to eat certain kinds of cheese. It's not supposed to eat certain kinds of fish. Should avoid lunch meat, deli meats, lox. I mean, just the list goes on, and it's absolutely baffling. I'm not sure what these women are supposed to eat. And it basically just sends the message that you're embarking on this highly kind of risky process that allows you to depart from, you know, the kind of natural course of your life. And I don't think that's a useful message to be sending. I think we're trying to kind of optimize life, or render life totally safe, and in doing so we're just choking it out. And so I see the Trump move, whatever. There are lots of things to get into with this, you know, the kind of RFK era HHS. But I see it actually as kind of in keeping with a broader thrust of the kind of medicalization of life and just declaring everything risky and dangerous.
The sociologist Jenny Bristow talks about this what you just mentioned there as the double bind, cotton wool kids, helicopter parents versus cotton wool kids, where it's, you know, everything becomes associated with risk. So the good mother is the one who protects their child from any and all risk. And this is just another one piled on top. You know, you should be afraid of alcohol. You should be afraid of, you know, minuscule amounts of alcohol that might be in the vanilla extract that's in your carrot cake. You know, it gets to such absurd amounts of policing of pregnancy. And so the good mother is the one who is aware of any and all risks and acts accordingly to protect her child from, and even her unborn child, from those risks. And then, but then they equally get criticized for being helicopter parents. That you're too worried about all of these risks. Oh, all of these, you know, and Jonathan Haidt does this all the time, where he's like, oh, well, all of a sudden, all these parents were cotton wooling their kids. And I'm like, it's your fault. You're the one who told them to do this. You said we were going to damage our kids if we didn't, you know, make sure that their well-being is on the front of our, you know, and we protect them from any and all risk. And then now we're protecting them too much. And now we've caused another problem. Everything. There's just nothing that can't be blamed on parents. And then, of course, as you say, you have this ironic result. So this sort of like this panic around alcohol during pregnancy, ironically, led to this enormous increase in abortions. Well, I don't know how enormous it was, but BPAS, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, actually had to put out a statement, I think in 2016, that actually said to women, you don't need to come in for an abortion if you didn't know you were pregnant and you drank alcohol. Because they were seeing this rise in women coming in for abortions who thought that they had irreparably damaged their children because they had drunk alcohol before they knew they were pregnant. So there was all of these potential children, these children that these women might have wanted, that were aborted because of this excessive attention to risk. And so it's no surprise that if you worry that you've damaged your child, you might go for an abortion. Or if you worry that all of this is just way too much, I will never be able to do this, that you just don't have children at all. And people say this all the time, well, don't have kids if you can't afford it. And don't have kids if you can't put in the time. But the expense and the time just keeps going up and up and up until there's just no time and no expense that would ever be enough. So it's just, I feel like that's one side of this that people are not really looking at. And I'm really glad that you brought it up, because it's just yet another thing. Like, oh, there's this autism epidemic, supposedly, which is really just massively expanding the criteria and getting people to watch out for all these different signs in childhood. And then finding a way to blame mothers, which has been going on for a very, very long time. But the other thing, too, is like, how do you know who to trust here as well? Because if, people are trying to say, oh, this is obviously very silly, and Trump is being crazy here with Tylenol being linked to autism. But do we believe you? I don't know. I mean, COVID showed us that those in the world of health didn't have faith in the public to be able to think that they could tell them the truth. They told them lies, things that they knew were lies, that they thought were benevolent, because the public was simply too stupid for the truth. So, who are we supposed to believe? And that puts the public in a really bad spot in terms of making decisions about their health, because you can't be an expert in everything. You've got to trust some authority figures. And yet those authority figures have lied to you again and again. So you just know that science has become irreparably politicized. So you're looking at Trump, you're saying, well, are you saying this because you're trying to stick it to somebody here? Or like, because RFK Jr. made a campaign that made a promise that he has to make good on somehow. What's the background story here? Everybody knows it's not just, oh, we have discovered in our white lab coat a link between Tylenol and autism. We know that there's a political backstory. But of course, science has been sold over to politics for a very, very long time. The public has only been belatedly become aware of this, that, you don't do science because you find it interesting. If you have some kind of pie in the sky hypothesis, you're not going to get any money for that. You're not going to get a promotion. You've got to tie your science to a series of agendas and objectives that maybe your university has or the state has, or you're not going to get funds. So science is being sold out for a very, very long time. And this puts the public in a really bad place where now they become aware of this and they're like, all right, so do I take a Tylenol? Can I have a glass of alcohol? Am I, destroying my children? Will I destroy? Who do I trust here? Who do I believe? I have no idea. And this is a state that's being created by this sort of politicization of science.
There was a moment in the press conference that was in which this supposed groundbreaking discovery was announced, that the White House and RFK and various other, official accounts retweeted repeatedly, in which RFK says something to the effect that 40 to 70% of women with children with autism believe that vaccines were linked to the autism their children developed, and it's time to stop gaslighting them and to believe them. So what was weird when I first saw this, I was like, whoa, this is just straight up sort of viewpoint epistemology. But then what's amazing is if you actually listen to the full clip, RFK explicitly says, well, the liberals say believe all women. Well, of course, they don't believe these women. And we need to believe these women if we're going to believe all women, essentially. So it's a very bizarre thing where, just in terms of the sort of mirroring and mimetic phenomena that always interests me, where they're explicitly taking this, apparently discredited, this tagline from the Me Too movement that, was later kind of seen as problematic even by its adherents, and saying, no, we actually are going to believe all women. And we need to specifically believe that these women, by virtue of their experience, and again, it is viewpoint epistemology, by virtue of their, lived experience, have some kind of insight into the causality of this phenomenon that we have to defer to. And so it's very interesting to see this kind of argument, which, we've seen crop up in all kinds of progressive contexts, that, well, it doesn't really matter what, quote unquote, the science shows. We have to defer to the lived experience of the victims, of those who have suffered from this phenomenon, and that they have a superior wisdom. And so I suppose what's kind of interesting here is I think you can tie this to why this sort of bizarre spectacle is happening, which is that, it seems with both parties, you have these sort of constituencies and you have a certain kind of high on your own supply phenomenon where these constituencies that are not necessarily particularly large, but are extremely enthusiastic and passionate, manage to get their people in key positions. And we've seen this happen. We saw this happen in the Biden administration. Get their people in key positions. And, because that representation is so strong, there is an ability to to exert pressure on the administration, and also to, by creating this feedback loop, because there's this extremely passionate, particularly online following that will sort of lap this stuff up. Once you do something like this, you can kind of score a victory just by, getting a bunch of sort of influencers to do a victory lap. And so this whole spectacle seemed entirely oriented towards that. And it was quite it was quite depressing in other ways I won't go into. But the thing that strikes me is that just yesterday, Ari Schulman, who's also my editor when I write for the New Atlantis, very good magazine on science and technology, had a piece in the Times profiling friend of Compact, Jay Bhattacharya, the NIH director, who's a very interesting and thoughtful guy, unlike his boss, in my view. And anyway, Ari kind of, I think, really covered, an essential point, which is that there are people here, involved in this administration, including Jay, who are, very serious reformers with, with a good deal of research to back them up. But unfortunately, the sort of, public-facing politics can, in many ways, kind of work against these, the kinds of reforms that Bhattacharya performs are not going to produce, quick and easy victories that you can sort of take. You can sort of do a sort of social media victory lap over. It's a much more, slow and complicated and behind the scenes process. So I would recommend people check out Ari Schulman's Times op-ed from this week about Jay Bhattacharya, just as a kind of interesting contrast, because he wrote it and published it before this weird press conference spectacle. But I think in some ways it speaks to the kind of contradictions between the public-facing aspects of this administration's sort of health reform policies and its, I think somewhat more interesting and well-informed, kind of behind-the-scenes operations involving people like Bhattacharya and Marty Makary, both of whom are again, sort of serious-minded people with interesting proposals for reform.
With that, thanks to Ashley, thanks to Geoff. Thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato. For more, go to contactnow.com/subscribe. It's the best way to support our work.